Hey Uganda guys, I want to talk to you a little bit about the chronology of the book of Daniel. If you read Daniel straight through from chapter 1 to chapter 12, it can get a little bit confusing because Daniel is arranged topically. You've got a historical section and then a prophetic section. And the problem is some of the prophetic stuff happens in the historical time frame, and some of the historical stuff happens in the prophetic time frame. So it gets a little bit confusing. So I put together this little chart here of the chronology of the book of Daniel. I'll show you this in a second. You remember the entire Old Testament timeline, single united kingdom. There was a division after Solomon died, Judah to the south, Israel to the north. The northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by Assyria in 722 BC. And then we've been studying the story of the southern kingdom, and we're now in the book of Daniel where we've seen Daniel actually be deported to Babylon. And then Ezekiel is deported, and eventually at the destruction of Jerusalem, everyone who survives is deported. So I'm going to put this up here to actually highlight what's going on in the book of Daniel chronologically so I can get a little bit more room. Daniel is taken in 606 before Christ, and this is in the first chapter of the book of Daniel. Now, something interesting happens in chapter 1, because it says in chapter 1 early on that Daniel would remain until Cyrus the king, until the first year of Cyrus the king. That is huge. What it means is that Daniel is the only guy who's going to provide us with historical and prophetic information all during that 70-year time frame. And as Daniel is among the very, very first who are deported in 606, he lives such a long time that he actually gets to see the first group of exiles get brought back to Israel under the generous hand of King Cyrus. So Daniel is the only guy that gives us prophetic information all during this 70 years. Now, Ezekiel, he is taken captive when he is about 30 years of age, and he gives his last prophetic word when he is age 54. That's in 571 before Christ. He gives a warning to Egypt in Ezekiel 20:29. So that's all we hear of the prophet Ezekiel. Now, Daniel, just for fun, is about 2 years older than Ezekiel. So Daniel was deported at age 18, a little later on, when the great deportation took place and Ezekiel was brought over. Around this time, Ezekiel will be 30, Daniel will be 32, Ezekiel is 54, and that's the last word we hear from him. Now, Ezra talks a little bit about this time frame, but he comes on much, much later. He reveals information about the first group of folks who come back to Jerusalem. So Daniel is the only guy who gives us prophetic information all the way through this 70-year time frame. A couple of things to remind us. So let's see, Daniel, 585 before Christ. This was fairly significant because those who had survived the destruction of Jerusalem a year earlier, they would make their way to the prophet Ezekiel. At that time, his mouth was supernaturally unlocked, and he was able to speak in normal dialogue with those survivors that he had not seen for about 11 years. Remember, the third chapter of the book of Daniel happened at the same time frame when the survivors came back and they actually saw Ezekiel. Remember Daniel chapter 3, where Nebuchadnezzar, out of insecurity, doesn't like what he'd been told 20-some years earlier. in Daniel chapter 2. Remember the vision about the statue that depicted ancient world empires and their order in which they would come onto the power. So Nebuchadnezzar didn't like that. He didn't like the thought that his kingdom would not last forever. So he set up a statue that was made of gold from head to toe, indicating he wanted his kingdom to be forever, and he wanted to contradict Daniel's vision that he had 20 years earlier. And that was a spectacular story because there were thousands and thousands and thousands there who feared man more than God, and there were just 3 who feared God more than men. Spectacular story in Daniel chapter 3. And that happened about the same time when the survivors from Jerusalem made their way over to Babylon. Daniel chapter 4 is a spectacular chapter as well. It's the conversion of Nebuchadnezzar. We always thought that the God of the Old Covenant didn't want anything to do with the Jew, but we got surprised. Didn't want anything to do with the Gentile, but we got surprised in Daniel chapter 4 when this wicked king Nebuchadnezzar professes faith in the Hebrew God, and he sends out a decree that all peoples, nations, and men of every language need to bow down before the Hebrew God. 573, towards the end of Ezekiel's ministry, he has given the prophecy of the millennial temple, Ezekiel chapter 40 to 48. We've been over that. And then his last word comes in 571 before Christ, again, when he is 54 years old. Now, this is significant here. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel gets an expansion of the information that he received early in his exile in Babylon. He was around 19 years old when Nebuchadnezzar had the dream, and only Daniel could interpret it in Daniel chapter 2. And you'll remember that the head of gold, which was Nebuchadnezzar, the chest of silver, which was the Medes and the Persians, and then the bronze, which was Alexander. Rome was the iron, and this iron and clay was this last kingdom that's going to come up someday that we're still learning about. Well, Daniel was about 18 to 20 years old when he got that vision back in Daniel chapter 2. And that's all the information Daniel had about end times, except in the book of Isaiah. Daniel could read about the rise and fall of Babylon. He could read about the Medes someday overpowering the Babylonians. But that's all the information that was available to Daniel from the time he was, 20 years old or so until the time here in Daniel chapter 7, when he is now 68 years old. And now Daniel gets an expansion of the information that was given to him back in Daniel chapter 2. So Daniel is not in the process of learning end times very fast. It takes a long time for Daniel to get it. 539, we see the fall of the Babylonian Empire. And that's kind of interesting because those same vessels that Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple of God back here in 606 before Christ, those same vessels were brought out to use in honor of false Babylonian deities. And we know what happened then, the handwriting on the wall and the fall of Babylon, where it was taken over by the Medes and the Persians. Here, shortly after that, we have Daniel chapter 10 to 12. Matter of fact, a lot is happening I couldn't get exact dates on between Daniel chapter 12, Daniel chapter 6, his evening in the lion's den, Daniel chapter 9, the 2 different 70s, and Ezra chapter 1. This all happens really, really quickly. Daniel chapter 10 to 12 is some pretty fantastic stuff there, because Daniel gives a layout of what is going to happen over the next 300 or 400 years before the New Testament starts. And he provides some spectacular detail about what happens between 2 entities. First is the king of the north. He is the guy, the ruler of the Syrian Empire. The second is the king of the south, who is the ruler of Egypt, and how these empires would clash over, a course of a couple hundred years or so. And there is remarkable detail that is given in Daniel chapter 11, and most liberals will say that can't possibly have been written out in such detail because it's pre-recorded history. But if you believe in God, you believe he's also capable of writing pre-recorded history. And what God does in Daniel chapter 11, he says, okay, if you can believe that I can predict with pinpoint accuracy things that are going to happen in 200 or 300 years, do you think that I could pinpoint with extreme accuracy things that are going to happen in 3,000 or 4,000 years? Very interesting thing to consider. And let's see. Oh, this was probably here. I forgot this one. This was probably Daniel's biggest accomplishment here, the 270s. He's reading his devotions one day from the book of Jeremiah, and he happens to see that the time of Israel's exile is almost over. And he goes, whoa, I see it's written in the Word of God that the 70 years is about up. He was reading from the book of Jeremiah. At that point, he prays a magnificent prayer where he invokes God, will you forgive us for our sin? And very soon thereafter, God permits the first group of exiles to return in the book of Ezra under the hand of a guy whose name is Zerubbabel, who's going to be instrumental in guiding the exiles and the reconstruction of the temple. So that's Daniel's a huge accomplishment. And another 70 that God reveals to Daniel is the 77s, or the 70 weeks of Daniel. This is a tool by which the Jew could pinpoint the timing of the coming of the Messiah. It's just pretty fantastic. And there's one more 7 that we still have coming our way. It's not going to be a very pleasant 7. It's the final 77 years of the tribulation period. So anyway, that's the chronology of the book of Daniel, and we'll keep moving forward. Talk to you guys soon.